included them on the bulletin board right outside the door. If you have not sectioned yet, please see me after lecture, back in that hall back there. If you can't do it, or if there are too many people, call me. My number is and this afternoon, I will be there from about 3 to 6, and then you could call me this evening from about 8:45 to 9. You can't call me this evening, I'm too busy. Tomorrow you can call me as well. Okay, so if you need to section or change your section, see me right after lecture or give me a call. Thank you.
Again, let me just remind you that Stuart Chandler is our head TA. His number is and I just announced my office hours from 2 to 4 Thursday afternoon in room 105, 5 Bryant Street. That's where the Chinese language and Japanese language officers are located. And there are 2 numbers for your reference, 496-6052, 495-3369. And especially in the first couple of weeks, don't get discouraged. Call again if it's busy or it's there's no one there to answer your calls. Confucianism is a worldview, a social ethics, a political ideology, a scholarly tradition, and of course a way of life. The English term Confucianism, unfortunately, is a misnomer in the sense that it's the wrong word to describe it, and yet we don't have a choice. The reason that it is the wrong word to describe what we have in mind here is that Confucianism cannot be translated back into either Chinese, Japanese, Korean. It doesn't make sense if it is translated to any of these languages. The term Chinese, Japanese, Koreans use in describing what we now call Confucianism, which is coined probably in the 17th century, was 儒家. This is a Wei Jia, that is the pinyin. Either way is fine. 儒家 actually means the scholarly tradition. And in fact, if Confucianism is misnomer, then to call someone as a Confucian is also somewhat inadequate. The person who identified himself as a member of the Confucian tradition basically considered himself a scholar, or in the modern context, an intellectual. It's much better for us to understand the Confucian tradition as the intellectual tradition par excellence in East Asia. If you have to find a functional equivalent of a Confucian in modern context, just try to think in terms of the idea of an intellectual. What does it mean by being an intellectual in the modern context that will help us to orient many of our ideas in reference to the Confucian tradition? It is a scholarly tradition, it is an intellectual tradition. To become a Confucian is to become a scholar, to become an intellectual. In this sense, Confucius was not the founder of 儒家, of the scholarly tradition. He was not the founder, probably the most important interpreter, transmitter. Therefore, now in English, we call the whole tradition the Confucian tradition, as if Confucius was the founder of a religion, but he was not the founder. It is not an institutionalized religion, cannot find the functional equivalent of a pope. in the Confucian tradition at all. It is not a worship-centered religion. The Confucians are not, in a sense, do not form themselves into a faith community. You do not become a Confucian, or you do not become an intellectual by going through some important initiation ritual, such as baptism. There's no ritual of that at all. You just become a Confucian by choosing to be, almost like your intellectual self-definition to become an intellectual or a scholar in the modern context. But the tradition has exerted a great deal of influence on government, society, education, especially family in East Asia. So when we talk about the tradition, we have particularly its relevance to public service, engagement in society, in education as character building, and also its concern for the stability of the society based upon the stability of the family. These are some of the basic assumptions. A distinctive feature of the Confucian moral orientation is its expressed intention to regard the everyday human world, the world we live in, as profoundly spiritual or profoundly meaningful. It is the ordinary world that is taken to be absolutely seriously as a spiritual domain. By conscious choice, Confucius and his followers did not create a spiritual sanctuary, a spiritual world, universe outside of the world we live in as the most meaningful world that we aspire to. So the tradition takes the lived, concrete world absolutely seriously. Therefore, Confucius considered himself as a transmitter rather than a creator. He's not the founder of a religious tradition. Very different from, say, Jesus Christ, the founder of Christianity, and Skyamuni, the founder of Buddhism. It's almost impossible for us to imagine someone is more Christian than Jesus Christ, or more Buddhist than Skyamuni. But it's quite conceivable that someone can be more Confucian than Confucius, if we use that English word. In other words, more intellectual, more scholarly than Confucius. In fact, Confucius made it very clear, it's not just a modest claim, that he said he's not a sage. He's not a sage. He was trying to become a sage. He was not a sage. And in fact, many Confucian followers respected him as if he reached the highest level of human perfection, as if he was a sage, but he knew that he still was in the process of trying to become one. We can even say in a dramatic way that Confucius may not have lived up to the highest Confucian ideal. The highest Confucian ideal is the sage king, a person who not only perfected himself as a human being, but also became the most important political leader of the land. The combination of political service of the highest level and also inner spiritual self-transformation on the other. This combination of sageliness and kingship into one is, of course, very legendary. It never happened in human history, I suppose. But many of the Confucians believe in the good old days, in the ancient times, they were sage kings, the legendary sage kings. And these sage kings, in fact, embody the highest Confucian idea, and Confucius, because the time betrayed him. He could have become a king if the time was right, but the time betrayed him. He never became king. And you can also look at this from a different angle and saying that Confucius failed to live up to the highest manifestation of Confucian ideal. Everybody fails. Confucius also failed. And it's quite understandable. Now, if Confucius was not the founder, nor was he the highest manifestation of Confucian ideal, it is quite reasonable to assume that the Confucians did not ask us to imitate Confucius. Therefore, in the Analects, we find learning is for the sake of the self. Learning is not simply to imitate others. To say learning is for the sake of oneself is to underscore voluntarism. You have to make up your mind what to do. But at the same time, a commitment to the process of learning as an end in itself rather than as a means to an end. As an end in itself, meaning that learning for the sake of the self is not simply a preparation for something else. In a dramatic way, you can say the purpose for social service as the natural outcome of my commitment to the process of learning for myself is, from the Confucian point of view, an erroneous conception. In other words, if I commit myself to social service, I try to train myself so eventually I will be helpful for society. That idea, in a strict sense, is not allowable in the Confucian context. You should learn for yourself, period, not for yourself as a means to social service. Of course, my interpretation has been challenged. I'm not saying that my interpretation is necessarily correct, but this is my appreciation or my understanding of the message. Learning for the sake of oneself is learn as an end rather than simply as a means to an end. But don't mistaken this idea for the self as a quest for a certain kind of inner spirituality, a quest for something interior. Therefore, you don't have to pay too much attention to the outside world or to others. It's not individualistic, certainly not egoistic. It's not self-centered. Later, it should become clear if we put it in a comparative religious context. The idea of the self, as I noted a few times before, is always a center of relationships. The idea of the self is not an isolated individual as a center of relationships. So for the sake of the self is not simply for the sake of my ego, my individuality, which has no connection with the outside world, because that conception of the person as a totally isolated individual is un-Confucian. Some scholars would say not even a negative, even a rejected possibility. They never rejected the idea that a person is an isolated individual. The reason they didn't reject it because they didn't imagine that was possible. They didn't even believe it was possible that people would regard themselves as isolated individuals. So a self, in this sense, is an open system, open to all kinds of possibilities of the outside world. If the self is an isolated ego, the self will become suffocated. There's no growth, no dynamism. The self will have to be opened to all kinds of possibilities. Just one illustration. In the art of reading, for example, you encounter texts like the Analects. There are two very different ways of reading. One way of reading is to impose your ego upon the text, which we often do without realizing it. We have all our biases, our prejudices, our sense of judgment, our sense of right and wrong. When we read a text, we judge it. It's boring. It's just a bunch of statements, very commonsensical. There's no logic to it. It's not very fruitful. It's not very stimulating. That sense of the text is a reflection of ourselves. It's a judgmental reading, therefore, an imposition of our own ego upon the text. Another way of reading the text, not just the suspicion there's something intelligent there, but the determination to understand why this text has been appreciated and has been studied for that long period of time by some of the most intelligent minds in East Asia. There must be something extraordinary about it. Not just simply to read about it, but see if I can learn something from it. Allow yourself to be opened to the voices of the text. And that reading will inform not only your understanding of the text, but even understanding some of your prejudices, some of your biases. So it's much more dynamic, open reading, rather than the superimposed judgmental reading of a text. The difference between an open and closed self. The closed self would be an ego. The open self is the self that is willing to encounter new experiences, new ways of looking at things, new perspectives. In this sense, then, the self, the Confucians believe, is always a dynamic process, like a river that flows. As a dynamic process, the self encounters other selves and becomes enriched. And eventually, even though for reasons the self may have to be imposed, superimposed in a kind of self-imposed isolation, the subterranean water continues to flow. It's not only open, it's a dynamic process, but it's also holistic. Holistic in the sense that the self involves the body. The Confucians all take the body absolutely seriously, including emotions, desires, inner feelings. The body is the proper home for the soul. So don't abuse the body as a precondition of helping the soul to be free from the constraint of the physical body. That idea is very un-Confucian. The body is absolutely crucial. But aside from the body, the heart and mind, the inner feelings, and the human intelligence, rationality, but also the soul and even the spirit. We'll get a chance to later to engage ourselves in the discussion. What is the Confucian idea of the soul? What is the Confucian idea of the spirit? But the body, heart and mind, and soul and spirit are all important dimensions of the self. The learning of the self ought to be holistic. We don't privilege one particular part of the self. We don't privilege our body at the expense of our heart and mind, nor do we privilege our body and mind at the expense of our heart and mind at the expense of our physical body. It is a holistic process. If we put this in the comparative perspective, even though I have to be quite general and even simplistic, you may get a sense how to situate the Confucian idea of the self in a comparative religious perspective. There are many, many ways of learning to be human. We talk about the Confucian tradition in reference to Hinduism, to Buddhism, to Greek philosophy, to Christianity, to Taoism, and many other traditions. Just a very brief account of some of the major concerns of the other religious traditions may help us to locate where the Confucian self is to be appreciated. From the Hindu point of view, the true self is understood as the Atman, the true self like a pearl that never changes. And the true self is always in touch, or it is a true manifestation of the cosmic self, or the cosmic spirit, Brahman. So you have this idea of the true self as a pearl. The pearl may be in the muddy water, but the pearl itself is unchanged, not defiled or polluted by the outside forces. Human life human life progresses in terms of stages. We begin with the life of the apprentice as a student to learn. Then we become a responsible member of the society, we become a householder who's in charge of a family. Then, at about 50 years old, we decide to leave the world. We detach ourselves from the family to become a forest dweller, to live in the forest rather than in the family, to become a renouncer, to renounce the world. And eventually, we become an ascetic. An ascetic meaning that we give up the sensuous pleasures or the desires and try to cultivate that which is true to ourselves, which is the Atma. So the goal of self-realization is eventually to leave this world and to cultivate our inner spirituality, independent of the social political forces of the world. We serve as a householder for a period of life. This Hindu idea of the stages of life sharply contrasted with the Confucian idea. The Confucian idea is you can never leave. You're always part of the world. You never leave. From the Buddhist point of view, the highest manifestation of one's spirituality, from the Buddhist point of view, is to enter into nirvana. Nirvana actually means all our desires, attachments, all our commitments eventually are dissolved. You know, like the candle that is blown off. There's no fire. Since there's no fire, we don't have to go through the transmigration. We are released from the samsara, from the world of troubles, the world of impermanence. So our idea, from the Buddhist point of view, our idea is eventually to enter into nirvana, to enter into a world that is totally or radically different. Again, the Buddhist idea became very inspirational to many Confucians. Some of the Confucians were very much attracted to the Buddhist idea. And yet the Confucians, by their own choice, could never eventually leave the world. They have to commit themselves to the world here and now. In Greek philosophy, the highest manifestation of the human spirit is the life of the mind. Therefore, the contemplative mode of life, how one would be able to think in fundamental ideas, is always cherished as a form of life. There's more emphasis on our intellectual quality, on rationality, on contemplation, than on praxis. Aristotle is different. And yet, even in Aristotle, there's still this tremendous emphasis on human intelligence and human rationality. In other words, the mind is infinitely more meaningful, more important than the body. In fact, we are still very much under the influence of the Greek idea of the separation between the mind and the body. From the Confucian point of view, you can never just cultivate your mind at the expense of your body. From the Christian point of view, as I noted earlier, all these are very simple, simple-minded and simplistic. But just to give you a sense of where to locate the Confucian style of moral reasoning, the emphasis is on faith. Faith in the transcendent, faith in God. We as human beings, no matter how intelligent, never understand in the ultimate sense of the will of God. Otherwise, it becomes blasphemous. And I use a term that a great Christian theologian by the name of Kierkegaard has used, the knight of faith. The person who's committed. The most important part of one's life is commitment to service, to the service of this transcendent reality. Much more meaningful than the world here and now. Therefore, the kingdom of God, yet to come, is much more meaningful than the world here and now. Within East Asian culture, in China, the most powerful challenger to the Confucian position is the Taoist idea. of spontaneity, especially the idea of self-soul. You should live the life of the natural human being. Any kind of cultural construction, any effort to try to shape the world according to some human design is not only misleading, it's distorted, and it may eventually may not work. Now, the Confucian choice against this very rich background seems quite clear. And when I say the Confucian choice, I'm quite aware of both the strengths and limitations of that choice. And you may have to think in terms of your own understanding of some of the critical issues. The first choice, as opposed to the Hindu approach, is to regard this world, the commitment to the world. Now, the commitment to the world is different from the adjustment to the world. The Confucians do not necessarily adjust themselves to the world and accept the status quo as self-evidently true. They can become major critics of the status quo. But using a fashionable term, they want to transform the world from within. They want to work within the system. They don't want to work totally outside of the system. In fact, they believe that all the values that are being created by the human community should continue to survive. They are conservationists. You can say they are cultural conservationists. They believe that all the values, all the cultures, music and art, everything that is being created has a value and should be able to endure. And the world as we live in is imperfect, is flawed in many ways. But the only way we can transform it is from within. A prior condition is to accept the world as something truthful and meaningful. You can even say that the sanctity of the earth. The earth is not something that is dirty, that is polluted. The earth is the proper home for our self-realization. The first choice then is to regard the world around us rather than the spiritual realm totally outside of us as the most immediate, most important. Then the choice of the importance of ordinary life, the primacy of ordinary life. Ordinary life, in fact, presents the most powerful challenge to the Confucians. It's not the heroic act. It is not great scientific discovery, but how you live your ordinary life day in and day out, and how to make some meaning out of that life becomes the greatest challenge. It is in this sense, some people say there's certain kind of egalitarianism. Egalitarianism meaning that every human being has to go through the same process. It is not elitism. Only a very few people need to worry about it. Every human being has to worry about it. And ordinary life, of course, is defined in very mundane way. The way we walk, the way we talk, the way we eat, the way we earn our living, the way we interact with other human beings. It is in this sense that the Confucians have characterized the body as the proper home for the soul. As we know that in modern philosophy, as well as in Greek thought, there's such a sharp distinction between mind and body. The mind has no physical substance, whereas the body is not at all spiritual or mental. So we have this very clearly differentiated realms of human experience. And this, of course, is diametrically opposed to the Confucian conception. The Confucian conception is you cannot think, you cannot reason, you cannot will without involving human feelings. And since feeling is an integral part of your being, the body may eventually turn out to be the most important determinant factor in terms of your self-realization. Recently, I remember there was a conference on artificial intelligence, and people were overawed by the advances in artificial intelligence in recent years. MIT, there's a lab of that. How the machine is able to play chess and to design complicated systems and so forth. But Bert Dreyfus, who is a leading scholar in artificial intelligence, raises the question, if we think artificial intelligence is a way of simulating the human experience, what happened to the body? The people who've been involved in artificial intelligence never thought of the question of the body. In terms of human intelligence, even though artificially constructed through our learning experience, is not at all separable from the emotional content, the basis of feeling. And if the body is totally cut off from our calculation, there's something fundamentally wrong in this kind of thinking. It is in this sense, then, the highest manifestation of self-realization in the Confucian point of view is the realization of the bodily design. Later in Mencius, we have this very important discussion. The full realization of our body is the metaphor for the full realization of ourself. Except the body is a holistic concept. It is not a limited concept of simply our physical existence. Because it is in the body that the heart and mind, the spirit, and the soul continue to function. The Confucians then differ very dramatically from the Taoists. When the Taoists considered it is important to express ourselves spontaneously, the Confucians advocated the importance of responsibility. The idea of responsibility is linked to the Confucian notion of the self always as a center of relationships. We're not only responsible for our own body, for our own ordinary life, we're responsible for those who are involved in our domain, continuously informing, enriching, and of course challenging us. So the choice, when we see the picture, is to regard the world as intrinsically meaningful. The ultimate meaning of life is realizable and must be realized in our ordinary human existence. The body is the metaphor for human self-realization. And there is tremendous faith, as contrasted maybe from the point of view of Christianity, in self-effort. In the sense, we as human beings can actually shape our destiny according to our own design. Some people believe that this kind of Confucian position is very existential. As we know, the 19th century existential philosophy, that is, we do not exist unless we be able to make choice and shape our existence by our own conscious design. Now, there is a paradox. The paradox is that the Confucians look at a human being from a multi-perspective view of the human condition. They don't look at a human being just from one particular point of view. They try to look at a human being from a number of perspectives. So the Confucians never try to define what a human being is in terms of one single characteristic. So they do not define human beings as rational beings, because human beings are also irrational and also emotional beings. They do not simply define human beings as political animals, because human beings are also social animals or aesthetic animals. They do not define human beings simply as tool users or as language manipulators. So human beings are endowed with many dimensions, many possibilities. And you have to understand a human being from many different perspectives. The Confucians try to understand a human being basically from 5 different visions. They have to be integrated, but on the surface, they could also be understood as 5 different perspectives. First, they understand a human being as a sentient being, a sensitive being. A human being in the animal kingdom is the most sensitive. Our heart and mind can be touched not only by the things around, but even by distant stars. We can relate meaningfully to virtually everything. Sensitivity is a defining characteristic of being human. But of course, we do not simply define human beings as sensitive or sentient beings. So in this sense, the Confucians talk about human beings as poetic beings, capable of poetry, capable of aesthetic, internal resonances, being able to listen to the voices of music, the voices of poetry. But human beings are also social beings. They're in connection. But so human beings are political beings. In terms of power, authority, and all these structures are a constitutive part of being human. But human beings are historical beings. This is something quite unique. In most of the spiritual traditions, whether in Hinduism, in Buddhism, or Greek philosophy, or Christianity, not to mention Taoism, history is not considered very important for shaping our way of life. In fact, we have to free ourselves from the past, from the conventions, from history. But the Confucians regard human beings are inevitably historical beings. And you can say the Confucians become obsessed with history. And a very strong sense of the historical memory conditions who we are. And finally, the Confucians also believe that human beings are metaphysical or philosophical beings. They want to relate themselves to heaven. Of course, we haven't defined what heaven really is in the Confucian tradition. It's not personal God, but it's transcendent. It's the source of life and the ultimate source of meaning. Maybe we can look at briefly Confucius himself in describing what he went through in terms of his own learning. As we noted, that Confucius is neither the highest manifestation of the Confucian ideal, nor he is certainly not the founder, but what he himself experienced or exemplified turned out to be helpful for us to understand the Confucian project. So it's one of the many examples of learning to be human. When he's in his 70s, maybe just a couple of years before he passed away, he recounted his own spiritual journey to his students. And he used a very, very brief statement. At 15, I set my heart upon learning. At 30, I firmly took my stand. At 40, I had no delusions. At 50, I knew the mandate of heaven. At 60, my ear became or was attuned. At 70, I followed my heart's desire without transgressing the boundaries of right. The most intriguing thing for us is to say, in Confucius' self-reflection about his life journey, it started at the age of 15 and then continues all the way to 70. No reference to what actually happened before. In the Christian tradition, the importance of the birth of the Savior. And we knew very little after the birth until he became 30 or so. But for Buddha and for all the other traditions, it's the very last stage of enlightenment that became greatly underscored. But here you have a whole range of human development from 15 all the way to 70. Why 15? Well, roughly speaking, it is the time when a choice was able to be made by the person, himself or herself. In other words, it's the time that a conscious choice could be made. It is not because one was socialized to become a certain kind of person. A critical choice was made. And the critical choice for Confucius was, of course, the choice of learning. And learning is always understood as character building, as learning to become human. That he began at the age of 15. At 30, when he said, I firmly took my stand, which means that as he established himself as a responsible adult member of his community. At 40, there's clear direction of his way of life. He's no longer making other choices in terms of particular form of life. He continued to involve himself in the world. At 50, he became aware of a transcendent dimension, very, very old in terms of his life. He didn't discover that before, but he became aware of the mandate of heaven, both as an assertion of his limitation. There's something that a human being would never be able to do. And also there's a sense of mission. What he's doing as a human being is not just related to his social ethics. There's also a transcendent reference. There's something much greater than simply the human being here and now. It's pretty intriguing to try to understand the idea of my year was attuned. There's a lot of scholarship involved in this process of trying to understand that. Obviously, it means the art of listening. It is a kind of receptivity. It's non-judgmental receptivity. You allow the voices to come in without making any prejudgment. Some people even use the expression, it's a kind of maternal care, the care of a mother who's willing to listen to the various complaints or voices, even the noises of her children without making any kind of a prejudgment. So there's a notion of receptivity, of being able to listen, is a very complicated art. And finally, at the age of 70, what he wanted to do and what he was able to do that was totally in conformity with established ritual became merged into one. In a sense, what it is and what it ought to be become totally fused. It's a kind of aesthetic fusion of necessity on the one hand and spontaneity on the other. Now, one major problem in the Confucian tradition is that the belief that we are not what we ought to be. There's always a gap between what we ought to become and what we are. At the age of 70, Confucius seems to be able to say that at this particular juncture of my life, what I am and what I ought to be have become one. There's a fusion of necessity on the one hand and spontaneity on the other. Now, the Confucians believe that every human being is constrained or limited, or you can say fated, to be a particular unique human being. So every person is unique. And yet, within that uniqueness of being a person, the openness of the self is to realize that uniqueness in such a way it can become a standard of inspiration for other human beings. So the struggle of one person is not simply meaningful to that person. It becomes meaningful to an ever-extending network of people associated with that person. So in this sense, he became an exemplar. Exemplar is not something that we ought to imitate, but it is a standard of inspiration. But that standard of inspiration to us is to say, well, he made it. There's a specific context in which he did it, but we have to do it ourselves. And how to deal with our own selves turn out to be the quest for self-realization, and which is cannot be traded with anyone else. So that process of learning to be human is contrasted with the Confucian idea of the exemplar eventually to become totally realized as a human being in terms of his own condition. The term eventually they use in describing him is the timeliness, the most fitting way of doing it. The timeliness, the fitting way of doing it is his own choice. And the choice is based upon his understanding of both his limitation and also his strength. I wonder if you have any questions. Yes. The question is, in the beginning, I tried to argue that Confucius himself was not the highest example, not necessarily the highest example of being a Confucian. And yet, in the description of Confucius' life as an exemplar, he reached the stage when what he wanted to do fused with the boundaries of right. In other words, what he ought to do became merged with what he wanted to do. So could that be considered as the highest manifestation? I think it's an excellent question. Let me try to make it clear. When I say Confucius was not necessarily the highest manifestation of Confucian ideal, I was taking the ideal of a sage king, someone who is not only important in terms of self-realization, but also important in terms of public service. That fused into one. That's the highest ideal. Confucius obviously failed. Though he was a wandering scholar, he was an intellectual, he never became politically prominent. But given the conditions that Confucius lived, we could say he made the best out of it. Since he made the best out of it, he became an exemplar in the sense he became a standard of inspiration for us all. Maybe I can take up one more question. I can repeat your question, so don't feel your question will not be heard. Anyone? Yes, please. The question is, at age of 50, Confucius said he knew the mandate of heaven. I mentioned that at age of 50, he became aware of a world beyond the world here and now. Therefore, he made a reference to the transcendent. The question is, if he considered the world here and now as the most important, what does it mean by this new realization of the transcendent? Again, I think this is, again, a very, very good question. For the Confucians, the world here and now is not just mundane. The world here and now is endowed with ultimate meaning. There is, you can even say, there's a spirituality in the material world we live. So we never regard this world as something so, just factual, something just out there. There's some other, there's a force. There's a center of meaning somewhere beyond the world here and now we can make reference to. However, the minute we try to make some reference to it, the reference has to be immediately meaningful to what we do here and now. So there's an interplay between heaven and human. There's a statement in the Analects say it's the human that can make the way great. It's not the way that can make human great. If you translate into another language, it's like it's the human that can make heaven great. It is not heaven that makes human great. Now the reason is that we are not creatures. We are in fact co-creators. What we do in our world turns out to be not only important for us as human beings or as social beings, but even for the cosmic order. So this sense of the person as responsible for linking not only yourself to the society, but also to the cosmos, is not a glorification of the human power. It is a humble realization of human responsibility. And how this can be worked out is a fascinating problem. Well, thanks for two very, very good questions.